Hello and welcome to RPGMD, a resource dedicated to writing you a prescription for all things dice, dragons, and gaming. Today we're going to be continuing our topic of last time, that of diseases, and diving in a little deeper. We'll be taking our topic to the next level with the help of the Malady Codex, a resource written by two medical students who sell this resource over on dmsguild.com for a whopping $3 whole. And believe me, as someone who was a medical student at one time, they could definitely use the money. Now, I will say that these diseases are not for the faint of heart and range anywhere from playing a practical joke on your players to a disease that could be campaign ending in the form of a pandemic. Now, these diseases offer great special challenge to those parties that haven't had to deal with diseases in the past very much, because maybe there's a paladin that can just play lay on hands and cure the whole party of their diseases lickety-split. And I do think these are a good challenge for that, but I do give you a warning that maybe don't inflict your paladin players for this, because if you start giving them diseases that they can't resist and can't heal, you're just going to not make your player feel very special, and that's no fun for the player, or really you, when you just have to hear them bitch about it the whole time. Just as a side note before jumping into these diseases, I did want to say that this is not going to be an in-depth statistical look at each disease, nor is it even going to cover all the diseases in the Malady Codex itself, because if you want all of that, I think you should go out and buy the Malady Codex from the authors and support them. But I will be giving you my insight and kind of different role-play ways to make these diseases your own and kind of be very descriptive and scare your party. So if that's more of what you're interested, let's dive into the first disease here. Now, if I say famous plagues and diseases, I'm sure one of the first thing you guys are going to think of is the Bubonic Plague. And what better way to start a video on advanced disease than the Black Death itself, which is a disease that killed more than 1/3 of the population of Europe in the Middle Ages. Now, the authors of the Malady Codex specifically warned DMs that this should only be used as a game-changing pandemic or city-threatening epidemic, and to be taken with extreme caution. But how exactly has the Bubonic Plague been transformed into Dungeons & Dragons? Let's take a look. Now, in our world, the Bubonic Plague is actually a bacteria known as Yersinia pestis that was spread by fleas that infested the local people of the Middle Ages by rats, fleas, etc. The game version of this disease plays off this history by introducing it as the curse of a druid whose altar was ruined by a raiding band of orcs. They fled into a flea-infested cave where his fellow druids died to a mysterious illness that caused bleeding from their necks and their fingers to turn black. The druid, having been the only one to survive this, realized that the fleas were the cause and harnessed their power to fight against the orcs and obtain his revenge. This disease is extremely infectious and should happen anytime player characters run into any fleas that were created by the druid. Now, role-playing this disease will be of the utmost importance for its impact on the campaign. DMs should ensure that a player character, or whoever is affected by this illness, gets hints that they've been bitten by fleas or some other kind of infected creature. And those hints should be dropped early on, that the players are either in a filthy town or a similar flea-infested cave, some kind of situation that should make the characters think back and be like, oh, that's when it happened. Now, biding your time is also going to be crucial to make the most of this disease in your campaign as well. Slowly describe after 5 or so days how the characters' necks begin to swell. They could feel odd bumps that are swollen or kind of painful to touch. And then in 2 to 3 more days, these lymph nodes should burst, causing tremendous amounts of bleeding that most people die from in about 2 to 3 days. Once a character is affected by this bleeding, they should be almost entirely incapacitated, as the anemia and overall bacterial burden would start causing things like fever, shortness of breath, fatigue. And while the Malady Codex does give some kind of advice on diagnosing this disease, it should be up to the DM to determine what characters have or have not heard of in this illness, and whether they can even realize that it's connected to the flea bite. Now, curing this disease is not as simple as a lay-on-hand spells, as the authors state that the druid specifically created this curse to make sure that it was protected by spells that remove disease, and that these spells rather slow the progression of the disease, still making your player characters feel like they have some use, but do not entirely cure the person. Players could also attempt to cut out their bleeding lymph nodes with medicine checks, but it's a pretty risky procedure, and they may kill themselves in doing so. Finally, there's also a very rare herb called spark leaf that the authors tell you about that can cure the disease, but requires the party to kill a shambling mound or whatever other monster the DM would like to throw in their campaign. But again, the ultimate cure will be left up to the players, the dice, and the dungeon master. Now, luckily, as a doctor of the 21st century, I have absolutely no real-life experience with the Bubonic Plague, and therefore don't have a lot of great advice for you guys in terms of describing this accurately to your players. It's kind of all up to you. I will say that it is a serious enough disease that I don't think that a lay on hands or lesser restoration should cure it, and definitely agree with the authors there. And I would say also that it's a bad enough disease that if the player characters or someone else is cured using a resurrection, that this death should really affect their character, and they should have dreams, nightmares, or whatever. They need to be very emotionally affected by this extremely gruesome death. Finally, I think that the Druid's Curse's greatest strength is in its ability to world build. Yes, it sucks to die of the Bubonic Plague, but even more so, it will create a situation that is believable to the players in that this is going to affect entire communities. The Bubonic Plague in medieval Europe was a huge deal, and it affected absolutely every single aspect of their lives. Are you going to say that the towns and communities have turned against the magic users and kind of blame them for the curse, or are they going to pick some other community? Maybe it's complete anarchy and the town just attacks the players because obviously strangers are the cause of the disease. Describe to the players how people have stuffed their pockets with different flowers and perfumes as they think it's related to smell or hygiene. Or maybe you even introduce kind of medieval gas masks. Whatever it takes, this should definitely be something that affects your ability to describe towns to the players, and the players should kind of feel that kind of looming weariness and bleakness that this disease should create in your communities. Our next disease is going to be Taurus toxic breath, a disease that is tied to a specific monster or boss creature that you may want to introduce into your campaign. And this disease is kind of portrayed by the authors as a way that a dragon has kind of subdued a town to be completely under his control, but you may want to just use it after a simple boss fight or use it to world build this town. Taurus toxic breath is a disease based off of the real-life disease called cholera, and adventurers who come in contact with this beast will be affected by his massive toxic fumes that he releases. They will then have watery diarrhea that is continuous and can even result in death from the resulting dehydration. This disease is one that has killed millions in our world for similar effects due to a bacterial toxin in the water. An infection is not something for your adventurers to scoff at, as they will quickly realize that this disease is to be taken seriously, or they will be left incapable of fighting due to sheer weakness. The authors give many interesting quirks to give a villain and how he or she uses the disease to dominate a population into weakness, but care should be taken to the disease as the sheer explosiveness of the symptoms should be described, and after a few hours of this, the player characters will be incapable of walking, have severe dry mouth, and even incapable of tears. Now, real-life cholera is treated with not only antibiotics, but giving local populations clean water, and also infusing that water with salt and sugar. Think kind of a homemade Gatorade. And if player characters can come up with this or roll high enough on their medicine checks, they should be rewarded by doing the same thing. The Malady Codex also gives the idea of if this is affecting an entire population, there's likely to be an underground resistance group that may have thought of a cure as well. And if the player characters are diseased by this before fighting the main boss, a main point of the story should be given to kind of curing this or face severe penalties when fighting the boss himself. Our next disease is going to be one called Lockjaw, a disease that's based off of the real-life tetanus. And as an emergency room doctor, I could not live with myself if I did not cover this disease, as I've spent way too much time making sure people's tetanus vaccinations are up to date, and that giving people boosters whenever they get small gashes, cuts, you name it. Now, the way tetanus works in real life is that there's a bacteria that can be found in the dirt, so any dirty wounds can become infected with this bacteria called Clostridium tetani, and Lockjaw, as presented in the game, comes into contact anytime there's an injury that the DM thinks is appropriate. Now, as a doctor, I'd say pretty much every injury in Dungeons & Dragons qualified. Get stabbed? Sure, you can grapple that troll into the mud. Arrow to the knee? Of course you can still escape that ooze that you're trapped inside of. Dungeons & Dragons is dirty work, and I'd say ripe with tetanus. I mean Lockjaw. Now, describing tetanus is actually something that's going to be really fun to your players, as basically you can give it to them at any time after any boss fight whenever you're bored, and the symptoms are really characteristic in that there's one called Rhesus sardonicus, which is basically your player character's face is going to be trapped in this kind of weird twisted smile, and they can't move it anymore due to the toxin that's produced by the bacteria. Another symptom is going to be like arching of the back that they're kind of stuck and can't move in. And I would say that this is a pretty common disease, and while it's kind of devastating in our modern day if you're not vaccinated, I would allow the paladin to heal the player, as otherwise they're going to be walking around every campaign like this. Now, the last disease we're going to cover today is ISTD, and yes, you heard me correctly, that's going to stand for interspecies sexually transmitted diseases. Yet another disease that I spend far too much of my adult life talking about in the emergency room. I've also just had the sudden realization that I've spent more than a decade of education to use that knowledge to talk about imaginary sex viruses on the internet. Are you proud of me yet, Mom? Now, fortunately for you and me, I'm not going to spend any time in this video describing the real-life effects of STDs, and you can look for that on the internet on your own. Coming back to the heart of the matter, ISTDs is actually one of the most complicated of the diseases that are listed in the Malady Codex, and while the mode of transmission is easy enough to understand, the authors take the time to think of each permutation of different race couplings in Dungeons & Dragons. These different iterations will cause different symptoms depending on the couple that was involved, which could include rash, joint pain, insert other symptoms here that I will leave up to your imagination, and there is a nice table that lists each iteration and their resulting symptom. This is another disease that I think it's okay if the paladin heals in the party, and they should probably hold it over the other party member for a little while, and I'm also okay with paladins not being affected by these, though you've taken some interesting vows if you're being exposed to things like this. And that wraps up another video for us, this one on Advanced Diseases in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Please leave any stories that you have about using these diseases in the comments below, as I'd be especially interested in hearing ones, especially about ISTDs in your campaign. I will be sure to leave a link in the description below over to DM's Guild, where you can purchase the Malady Codex for, again, a whopping $3 whole. Feel free to like, favorite, subscribe, and thank you to anyone who's made it to this far in the video. If you missed my video last week on the basics of disease, you can find a video linked to that right over here. Next week, we're going to be covering 10 different monsters that inflict disease onto your characters, and that is going to wrap up our series on disease in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I'm RPGMG, writing you a prescription for all things dice, dragons, and gaming.